Okay. Hi. Yep.
Hi, I'm James MacManus, and I'm the author of this book. I'm very happy to be talking to you this afternoon.
Questions? Looking for questions. Okay, where are the questions? You have to read it. Okay. So the question is, what is your biggest draw to historic figures? Were you always a history buff? That's the question.
Yes, I was always a history buff, and I studied American history at St Andrews University in Scotland a long, long time ago, I'm sad to say. And it was at St Andrews that I first came across the story of Harry Hopkins. I was lucky enough to have an American tutor. I was studying American history, and my tutor said to me that Harry Hopkins was a hero who'd been forgotten on either side of the Atlantic, and who had, as he put it, fallen through a trapdoor in history.
You're not going to hear anything. Yep. Harry Hopkins was never elected to office or confirmed in official government post, but why not?
I think you're wrong there. He was actually briefly Secretary of Commerce, and he was confirmed in that position. But because of his illness, he had a major cancer operation in 1936. He gave up that post. But you're quite right. He was essentially a political backroom boy, a political fixer, if you like. He was someone who could cut through bureaucratic red tape, and that was his great value to President Roosevelt. And that's why President Roosevelt became very close to him, because Hopkins was the sort of man who could get things done. And that's what on what President Roosevelt placed great value, particularly when Britain went to war in 1939. This is a great question. I love this question. The answer is I would love to have lived in the era of Black Venus, i.e. Paris in the 1840s and 50s. What a wonderful time. Monet, Baudelaire, all the great French writers. But I would choose to live in London in the Blitz, 1940, 1941, because London then was a city that was alive, even in the midst of the death and destruction. It was a city in which people found a reason to live and to fight and to do that together. And it was also, let us not forget, a city in which Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister. And what a great time to watch a great leader in action. That's what I would have chosen, therefore. London in the Blitz. Well, I did an awful lot of research for this book, so obviously I couldn't include it all in the book because it's a novel and not history. I think the history is very accurate, and I've worked very hard to make sure that it comes across in a very realistic fashion. So there's naturally a lot I left out, but nothing that was really important in terms of understanding the characters. And I hope, if you have a chance to read this, that you will get closer to President Roosevelt, a great man, closer to Winston Churchill, equally a great wartime leader, and equally close to a man that's been forgotten, as I've already said, by so many people in both countries on either side of the Atlantic, Harry Hopkins. And I haven't left anything out that really helps people understand those leaders, those people, and their motives. Well, I struggled for a long time for a title for this book, and I never actually came across a title that struck me as absolutely right, and nor did my publishers either. When I looked at a little poem I had written for the heroine of this story, Leonora Finch, to send to Harry Hopkins in Washington, I realized I got the title. And that poem, if you'll indulge me, I'll read it, 24 lines. She wrote him a note: "Sleep in peace tonight, remember we who fight, the fiery death that falls from London's dazzled skies." And I realized instantly that "Sleep in Peace Tonight" was a great title. I hope you agree. There are many reasons for this, and you're quite right. His contribution to American and British history has been forgotten. One reason is that Harry Hopkins died in 1946 before he could write his memoirs, and Roosevelt died at the end of the war in 1945 before he could write his. So neither man was able to put on record what Hopkins actually did and what he achieved. Another reason is that Hopkins was deeply unpopular in Washington. He was loathed by the Republicans for his left-wing policies and distrusted and disliked by the Democrats for his unparalleled access to the president in the White House. And remember, he actually lived in the White House. So this caused great resentment, and there was nobody really around after the war to immediately pay tribute to the kind of contribution he'd made. The one man who did, of course, was Winston Churchill. And in the third volume of Churchill's great six-volume history of the Second World War, Churchill pays lavish tribute to Hopkins. If I can give you a flavor of just one phrase he used, he said of Hopkins, "In the history of the United States, few flames have burned brighter." Well, I've delivered my next book, which is set in Berlin in 1938, and it's called Midnight in Berlin. And like most authors at this stage of the process, I am incredibly secretive about the story and the characters in it. But I think it'll work quite well. It is another historical novel set in that World War II era. Well, I have very clear views on this. I think both Scotland and the United Kingdom would be diminished if Scotland had succeeded in seceding. I don't think the economic case was made for that secession, and I think Scotland would have been left a third to a fourth-rate nation struggling to survive in the globalization, in the global economy. And it was an understandably romantic attempt, I think, but one whose failure will enrich both Scotland and the UK. We are much better together. Well, they had a huge influence on Harry Hopkins, although I need to say very quickly that there's no record that Jimmy Stewart actually met Hopkins. Ed Murrow did, of course, meet Hopkins. But I think the point here really is that Ed Murrow, a great American journalist, a great broadcaster, did a huge amount to bring American opinion round in the dangerous year of 1941 to the fact that it was in America's interests to support Britain in its fight against fascism on the continent. Now, Jimmy Stewart is an absolute hero in my view. He came to Britain defying his studio MGM. He just made a very successful film, The Philadelphia Story, for which he was awarded an Oscar. And he volunteered to fly with the RAF. He was already a trained pilot, and he did do that. In fact, once the USAF had established itself in Britain after Pearl Harbor, he flew 17 missions over Germany as a pilot of a bomber. That was a high-risk thing to do for a major Hollywood movie star, and showed his commitment to the battle that we all faced then. Amazing. Oh, I love questions like this. Well, the person I would love to see as Harry Hopkins would be Tom Hanks. I think he would be absolutely amazing. He has the range, he has the ability, and I think Hanks would be attracted to the role because Hopkins was a multi-layered character. He wasn't an easy man. But you have to remember what Hopkins achieved in becoming a close confidant of President Roosevelt and a trusted envoy to Winston Churchill was almost beyond remarkable. How he did that would make, I think, a great role for an actor such as Tom Hanks. Well, a lot of research went into it, and I took great care to get that research right. And that research began a long time ago in Scotland, where I was lucky enough to have an American tutor. And ever since then, I've been reading about Hopkins and about that era. There are plenty of books, of course, on Churchill and plenty on Roosevelt, and indeed on the relationship between the two. There are not so many on Harry Hopkins himself, but the basic source material was the two-volume the White House Papers of Harry Hopkins by Robert E. Sherwood. That's a tremendous source of material if you wish to look it up. Well, it's a very good question. I don't think Harry Hopkins was unique in that he managed to get Churchill's trust very quickly, and he came to the view also very, very quickly that America needed to really support Britain. But I think it's fair to President Roosevelt that if he hadn't had Harry Hopkins, he would have sent somebody else equally, if not equally, certainly up to the job. And Churchill, don't forget, was desperate for American help. He would have taken any envoy that Roosevelt had sent and won him with his amazing oratory and his powers of persuasion. I'm glad you love it. I love it too. I had nothing to do with it. I'm not a graphic designer, but I think the publishers in America, Thomas Dunn Books, have done an amazing job, and I agree with you. Everyone loves it. I haven't seen Ken Burns's series. I've heard a lot about it. It's just beginning to air in Britain, so I shall catch up on those programs when I get back. And I hear great things about it. And it is true. It is great timing with my book because we do cover much of the same ground. And certainly he devotes a lot of time to Hopkins and Roosevelt. Okay, we done? Guys, the power's off.
I just want to.
Oh, I see. Sorry.
No problem.
Uh,
10 more minutes?
no. Churchill's excessive drinking, and it was excessive by the standards of today, did not interfere with how he ran the country. In fact, it was how he operated. It was how he dealt with the stress and strains of the job and the fear of defeat. And there was a big fear in 1941. Churchill did not drink quite as excessively as has been reported. He would at lunchtime start with some wine. He always had a glass to hand. And he would finish late in the night with a brandy or so. It was continuous sipping rather than gulping. So there's no doubt that he consumed far more than any doctor would consider advisable today, and that few people, including Harry Hopkins, could keep up with him. But he had the kind of constitution which could cope with that. And don't forget, he ate very well indeed. He loved the pleasures of the table. So he had a prodigious appetite for fine food and fine wine, and it always was fine wine or brandy. And I think the food helped him deal with the vast quantity of alcohol that he drank. But no, it never affected his running of the country. In fact, without it, he would have been much worse at running the country because I think the stress would have got on top of him. Well, we in Britain loved Mad Men, of course, when it came over, and particularly House of Cards, the great show about, or shows plural, about intrigue in the White House. That's an amazing, absolutely amazing series, and I think Series 3 is coming out soon, and I can't wait. A wonderful show with great acting, Robin Wright and Kevin Spacey. Kevin Spacey. I wanted to. First of all, it was a great story. Here was a man who had won the trust of two great wartime leaders. Here was a man who created the relationship between those two leaders, a man who was the catalyst for the wartime alliance. Now, that in itself was just a great story. But here also was a man who has been largely forgotten in his own country, America, and certainly forgotten in the United Kingdom. A man to whom we owe a big debt of gratitude. And to some extent, I wanted to tell his story to remind people of what he achieved in the dark days of World War II, when we did indeed face defeat. Exactly a year. But don't forget, I had done a lot of the research in the years previously. I'd done my reading. I'd taken notes. So I had a very good grip on the history of the period. And then it was down to the writing and more research, because as you write, you have questions to answer and so on and so forth. Leonora Finch is an important character in this novel because I wanted to give Hopkins a relationship that revealed more about him as a man. And it was perfectly true that in the London of 1941, during the Blitz, in the blackout, social mores crumbled. People had affairs, people were falling in love, extramarital liaisons were taking place. That was just London then. And people lived then as if there was no tomorrow, because let's not forget, for 40,000 people, there was no tomorrow. That was the number of the people who died. So in that hedonistic, sort of intoxicating environment, it was not surprising that someone like Hopkins, who was given a woman driver by Churchill, would fall in love as the bombs fell on London. And as I said, I hope she comes across as a character in her own right. She's a very strong woman. She wants a front-line role in the war, and she gets it, joining the Special Operations Executive, which was a guerrilla unit parachuted into France to create mayhem behind the Nazi lines. And I don't want to give too much away, but all that is entirely true to the kind of thing that happened in those days. Yes, I would consider writing a different genre, if by that you mean changing from historical fiction. I would write and will write a novel that is completely different, and I can't really tell you what sort of genre it would be. It would be a romance. I think that would be the thing, and it would have, as I have here, very strong women characters, female characters. That's a great question. Oh yeah. Well, I would love to ask Franklin Roosevelt this question. Did you really dislike Churchill so much before the war, to the extent that you called him a stinker when remembering when they first met in 1918? I would love to know the answer to that. I would love to ask Winston Churchill whether he told Roosevelt and Hopkins the absolute truth when he claimed in January 1941 that he feared above all else an invasion across the Channel by the German army, because there's some suggestion that he knew perfectly well that that had been postponed. As for Harry Hopkins, I'd like to ask him whether he fell in love when he was in London. Good question. It wasn't so much his motivation. President Roosevelt needed Harry Hopkins on several levels. He needed him because he trusted his advice. He trusted his advice because Hopkins had no side to him. He represented no party. He represented no vested interest. He was therefore entirely the president's man, and he was not afraid to tell Roosevelt things that Roosevelt did not want to hear. That was one of his great strengths, and the president recognized it. So it wasn't that Roosevelt was motivated to put faith in Hopkins. It was the fact that he did so knowing that Hopkins was utterly loyal to him. So I suppose that was the motivation, if you like, loyalty. The one thing I would like them to take away is that we in the United Kingdom owe Harry Hopkins a huge debt of gratitude, because he performed a service for us during the Second World War that really helped us survive at a critical time. And Churchill makes that point again and again in his history of the conflict.
I want to thank everyone for joining us today for our live chat with James MacManus, and I just wanted everyone to know to stop by Booktrib after the chat. We have signed copies to give away, so please stop by and enter to win. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, James.
Thank you very much. Oh.